Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, this is John Corcoran here with Mark Bayer. Mark, I'm very excited to have you here. We're going to get started, and thanks everyone for being here. So, I'm the host of the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where I talk with CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs of companies and organizations like YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard, which is the world's largest video game company, LendingTree, OpenTable, Axe Software, and many more. Also the co-founder of Rise25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And I'm very excited today because my good friend Mark Bayer is here. He's my guest. He's the president of Bayer Strategic Consulting and the When Science Speaks podcast. Bayer Strategic Consulting is a specialized training and advocacy firm in the Washington, D.C. area. He's a former U.S. Senate Chief of Staff and self-professed persuasion nerd, teaching scientists and engineers to effectively communicate the real-world value of their work to their most important stakeholders in jargon-free, engaging terms that get results. He's also the host of the weekly When Science Speaks podcast. He's an international keynote speaker, workshop presenter, online course developer, and consultant, and has nearly 20 years of experience, or over 20 years of experience on Capitol Hill related to all of this. And of course, Mark, we've been working together for a while. We helped you to set up your podcast, but we take credit for such a small piece of it because you've done an amazing job of really establishing yourself as really the thought leader in this area of helping scientists and helping technical folk to communicate more effectively. So let's just start right there. You know, you're a former U.S. Senate Chief of Staff. Why did you decide to start a science-related podcast? And then we're going to get into the topic here, which is how to communicate complexity in a simple way.
Sure. And John, thank you so much. I mean, you and Jeremy and Rise25 have been fantastic. And I love doing the podcast, getting a chance to talk to a lot of people who are much smarter than I am. And but I'll tell you just briefly, I got into this because I wanted to empower scientists to have their voice heard, kind of at the highest levels, whether it's policymaking, in the investor community, with the public. I really kind of feel that expertise and facts and evidence, all the things that we built our policy on Capitol Hill, are in this environment being sidelined. And scientists, scientific boards are being disbanded. Scientists are being completely marginalized from the policymaking process, and healthcare, environment, all the things that I care so much about and that you work so hard on, during my time on Capitol Hill. And I thought, I had some skills, some insider, specific skills that I could teach to scientists. And, after the 2016 election, it seemed like scientists were really interested in getting more involved in policy and getting, increasing their influence beyond the academy, beyond the university setting.
There's a lot of talk of that, the scientific method was under attack, or that it was the whole talk of, fake news and alternative facts and all those. That's kind of, phrases have entered the whole national dialogue and the zeitgeist. So talk a little bit about where we are as we're in the beginning of 2020. What is the feeling these days in terms of how seriously science is taken and how scientists need to communicate to be effective today?
Yeah, I mean, just taking the last piece, I think there is this acceleration of interest in the scientific community, whether we're talking about social scientists, we're talking about natural scientists, also engineers as well, technical professionals, an interest in understanding and a really drive to get more involved in making decisions that impact all of us. So whether it's, what's a safe level of mercury in water, it should be done by the science, by the, proven evidence and fact built up over time that scientists have contributed. It shouldn't be driven, in my view, by ideology or anecdote or, kind of conflicts of interest. These are things that have life and death consequences for us, not to be too dramatic, but I mean, these are things that the amount of pollution in the air and so forth that scientists have been studying, and they continue to study. And I want to make sure that the best facts that can come out of the scientific community actually kind of return to or become much more prominent again in deciding, for EPA or, Department of Health and Human Services deciding, what are the safe levels, for example. So I think scientists and people who are working in that area, engineers and so forth, are getting more involved and want to get more involved and kind of pushing back, to get to your first part of your question, on these alternative facts, so to speak. So that's kind of a passion project of mine, and I do a lot of talking. I've written about it. I wrote a piece. I've talked about it at the AAAS conference. There's an article in Science Magazine about my talk, and I put some comments in the New Yorker magazine that they printed about, how do you combat alternative facts? And what are they really? Obviously, they're not true. We all know that. I'm not really interested in what you want to call them. My interest lies in how do you push back and combat them and get the actual facts out there, whether it's regarding vaccines, whether it's global warming, whether it's GMOs, anything else where there's just a lot of demagoguery and out there. How do you confront that, or should you? And this is how I, when I go and I talk at universities and so forth. It's a popular topic because truth and evidence and discovery is really kind of the oxygen that fuels our economy in many ways. And if that's no longer important, then scientists and others who spend their lives trying to discover and establish new facts, it puts them in a very, very difficult position.
Now, Paulina Masson posted a question here. She asked, do you have a background in science? What made you choose this niche? Which I think you addressed a little bit already, but any further thoughts on that?
Sure. I love that question so much. My last science class was AP biology in high school at Framingham North High School outside of Boston. I always kind of add when I'm talking to scientists that I got a 5 on the AP exam, so I'm not a complete idiot. But it really was see you later science for me after that, because I had to work really hard to do about 80%, 90% as well as people who are really gifted in that area. My background kind of in science is more rooted in the policy making, where when I worked on Capitol Hill for about 20 years, all told, in the House and in the Senate, as you mentioned, we always had scientists from AAAS, experts, PhDs, and so forth, who were literally sitting side by side with us as we were developing policy. And I had tremendous respect for them and really believed that we needed to rely on facts and evidence and do digging until we really got to the root of, and that was the foundation of all the policy that we did. So my kind of experience with scientists and respect for scientists comes in that policy environment. And then after I left the Hill, I did a workshop and talk for AAAS, and I go to universities across the country and talk to PhDs and postdocs about their work and also how they can translate their work in an effective way and basically communicate their science to any audience, whether that's their grandma, their grandpa, their cousin, or some venture capital, some investor, to the media. How can they get their voice heard in a way that's accurate, but also really gets to the crux and the real world relevance of their work?
I remember a while back you posted something on LinkedIn. There was a Mars rover that got a lot of attention. That was, I think, it was dying. Tell us that story, and also why that story was relevant for communicating complex topics effectively in today's climate.
Right. Such a really good question and example. And there was so much response to that post, and there was a lot of response to the initial posting, that went out about this. So, people, I think the general public had a sense, NASA was exploring Mars, and there's a rover, there was a miniature vehicle out there, was sending back images, and people were captivated. They could see the surface of Mars, which was really just mind-blowing. I have to say that NASA does a great job, by the way, when it comes to communicating technical topics. And so as time was going, going on, the rover that had sent back all of these very moving, compelling pictures was running low on power. Its battery was starting to die. And the thing about the atmosphere of Mars was that there are these storms that can completely obscure any kind of sunlight coming in because its battery was being charged through solar panels on the rover. And so there was a tweet that went out, and actually there's a story behind that whole thing, but the bottom line was there was a tweet that went out that basically said, my battery's low and it's getting dark. And
it's so sad.
And people all across the spectrum, went and retweeted and commented, and there was a lot of emotion that people were expressing. They said, like, I'm bawling
about a robot, about a machine.
Yeah, I'm bawling my eyes out here, and this is so sad. And so we're gonna come get you, buddy. Like, we're gonna. I mean, it really was all over. And I put that because it was a beautiful. I posted because a beautiful example of using emotion to tell a story. Everything he said was true. It's battery powered by the sun, all those sorts of things. But the way it was described really was via another kind of channel that we as humans respond to, and that's the emotional channel. Obviously we're not always making decisions on data and fact. Otherwise, we'd all have the same car, it'd be the same color. We just basically look down a checklist and say, yep, it's if it's got these features and functions, then I want it. But obviously, we're moved by things that are well beyond the data, how things make us feel. And that really goes to the emotional aspect of it. So I posted it because I really love the way people responded to that. It was an example for me to use as an illustration of, you can, of course, once you have that opening, you can start talking about the program to Mars. You can start talking about NASA's other activities, whether it's the policymakers or the general public, and get them fired up. You've reached them, you've touched them in a way that now they're open to more communication with you.
Right. Now, Yana Sedavi is here. Hey, Yana, good to see you. She says, my general experience is that people, even quite smart ones, are not persuaded by data and logic. Deeply held beliefs need something else to be dislodged. How do you help scientists use tools other than data, logic, and stats?
I mean, that's a great question. Comes right after we were just talking about. Such a great question. Is this idea that I talk about, which is connect before you communicate. So before you even think about what you're going to say, you really need to develop some kind of connection with whoever the audience is that you're talking about. And I teach a course. I do workshops on this. How do you develop that connection before the communication? And I would just say to this question, first of all, I think it's great that you've identified the fact that it's not just about the data. And Joe Hansen, who I love, has this great quote that the data is a character in your story, but it's not your entire story. So data, I'd say, is necessary, but it's not sufficient. If you're talking to maybe Mr. Spock or someone who only makes decisions on what's logical,
or maybe like C-3PO or something like that.
You just use the data. But we know that in the real world, that's not how things work. So how do you bring that more emotional component in? And for me, what I teach is you need to figure out how you can connect with whoever you're talking to before you even decide what your message is. And actually, through this connection process, you're going to surface these similarities, shared values, and things like that you can weave into your description. And that will allow you both to kind of broadcast on the emotional kind of channel, the connection channel, but also the fact-driven channel, because everything you say needs to be accurate, but that's not enough. Humans are complex. We make decisions based on a lot of different factors, that many of which are not logical. So how are you going to do that? The good news is, though, you can learn these things, and it's not manipulation. I like to say it's everything you're using is completely accurate. It's a level of sophistication that just you're recognizing another element in the decision-making process of a human being.
We have one last question and then we'll wrap things up. But Paulina says again, how do you gauge your audience's technical knowledge level? That's a great question. How do you know how much they know in terms of their technical knowledge?
Right. And that's I love it. There are different ways of doing that. Some are, before I go and talk to a university or a company, first of all, I talk to the organizer and I say, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? Would this be relevant or not? You know the group better than I do. That's not always, possible. You could do that, or you start following people on Twitter. Looked at LinkedIn, see what they're posting. And the other thing you can do is, if you can't do any of that, start your discussion with questions. Who here has ever seen, whoever heard of this? What if we could do this? Like, who has any experience? And that serves a number of great purposes. One is to get to this question that you've raised here, which is, how do I find out their level of knowledge? Who here has ever heard of, X, thermonuclear, whatever it is, thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics. And then you can start engaging right away with your audience. And it's sort of another thing to keep in mind is, I don't want you to think about doing a presentation. I want you to think about doing an engagement. Where it's much more interactive. And through that interaction, you're going to get a good understanding of level of knowledge and also level of interest.
That's right. That's great, Mark. Well, we'll wrap things up. And thanks so much for being here. Of course, this episode was brought to you by Rise 25 Media, which I co-founded with my business partner, Dr. Jeremy Weiss, where our mission is to connect you with your best referral partners and customers and strategic partners. And we do that through our Done For You podcast solution. I honestly believe if you have a business, you should have a podcast. I know Mark would agree. One of the best things that we've both done, and it's a privilege to be able to talk to smart people like Mark and others, which he's doing as well through his podcast. Really? So definitely consider it. And if you want to learn more, you can go to rise25.com. And if you want to learn more about Mark, go to BayerStrategic.com. It's up there on the screen. And Mark, anywhere else people should connect with you? Here on LinkedIn, of course. Anywhere else?
Well, I would just say my website right now is in the process of being revamped and refreshed and redone after about 3 years. So it's still very much up, but the descriptions of what I do are dated. So I would encourage you, just go to LinkedIn, send me a connection request. I'd love to begin the conversation.
Excellent. All right. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
Revolution.
And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.